Sometimes life leaves you with nothing but the courage to take one more chance. Clara Hensley knew that feeling all too well as she stood in the dusty town square, clutching her last few dollars, while the neighbors whispered behind her back. The 65-year-old widow had come to bid on a ranch hand at the annual auction. When she pointed to Eli Boone, the biggest and most dangerous-looking cowboy anyone had ever seen, the whole crowd burst into laughter. They figured she'd lost her mind. But Clara saw something in his eyes that nobody else noticed. Over the months that followed, this unlikely pair would discover that respect and kindness can bloom in the most unexpected places. Could a gentle widow and a hardened cowboy change each other's lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Hensley Ranch, where Clara sat in her late husband's rocking chair, running her fingers over the worn wooden arms that Thomas had carved with his own hands 30 years ago. The chair creaked with each gentle movement, a sound that had once brought her comfort, but now seemed to echo the emptiness that filled every corner of her world. 2 years had passed since Thomas's heart had given out during the spring roundup, leaving Clara alone with debts she couldn't pay and a ranch she couldn't manage. The cattle had been sold off one by one to cover the mortgage payments, until only the empty pastures remained, their fences sagging like the shoulders of an old man carrying too heavy a burden. Clara twisted the simple gold band on her finger, Thomas's wedding ring, which she'd moved to her own hand after the funeral. She couldn't bear to take it off, though it hung loose now on her thin fingers. The ring caught the morning light, reminding her of better days when the Hensley Ranch had been one of the most prosperous spreads in Dry Creek County. The town of Dry Creek lay 3 miles east, a collection of weathered buildings huddled around a main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a widow's struggles became the subject of coffee shop conversations and church social gossip. Clara had felt their pitying looks at the general store, heard their whispered concerns about poor Clara, who was surely going to lose everything. But pity wasn't what stung the most. It was the subtle suggestions that she should sell the ranch and move into town, maybe take a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. "It would be so much easier for you, dear," they'd say, their voices dripping with the kind of kindness that felt more like condescension. "A woman your age shouldn't be trying to manage all that land by herself." A woman your age. The phrase followed her everywhere, a constant reminder that at 65 she was expected to shrink into the background, to accept her limitations and gracefully fade into the role of the pitiful widow who'd lost her way. Clara stood up from the rocking chair, her joints protesting the movement, and walked to the edge of the porch. The ranch spread out before her in all directions, 800 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory, with a creek that ran year-round and natural windbreaks that protected the pastures from the harsh winter storms. Thomas had chosen this land with the eye of a man who understood cattle and weather and the delicate balance between them. "This place has good bones," he'd told her on their first day here, when they were both young and full of dreams. "Give it time and care, and it'll take care of us for the rest of our lives." He'd been right, for a time. The ranch had prospered under Thomas's steady hand and Clara's tireless work. She'd cooked for the hired hands, tended the vegetable garden, helped with the bookkeeping, and even assisted with the roundups when extra hands were needed. She'd been a full partner in every sense, though the legal papers bore only Thomas's name, a common practice that now left her vulnerable to the bank's increasingly impatient demands. The sound of a horse approaching drew Clara's attention to the dirt road that led to town. Sheriff Bill Rawlings rode up to the porch, his weathered face creased with the uncomfortable expression of a man bringing news he'd rather not deliver. "Morning, Clara," he said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man past his prime. "Mind if I sit a spell?" Clara nodded toward the other chair on the porch, though her heart sank at the formal tone in his voice. Bill had been Thomas's friend for 20 years, and his visits had become increasingly official since her husband's death. "I suppose you've heard about Saturday's auction," Bill said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair with a sigh. "Hard to miss the talk about it in town," Clara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. The annual labor auction was a tradition in Dry Creek County, held every spring when the ranchers needed extra hands for the busy season. Men down on their luck or between jobs would offer their services to the highest bidder a month's work, sometimes a whole season, in exchange for wages, room, and board. It was a system that worked well enough in a territory where steady employment was scarce and the work was hard. "There's been some talk," Bill continued, his voice careful and measured, "about your situation here. Some folks think, well, they think you might want to consider your options." Clara's jaw tightened. She knew what some folks meant: the bank president, the wealthy ranchers who'd been eyeing her land, the well-meaning church ladies who thought they knew what was best for her. "What kind of options, Bill?" "The Hartwell spread is looking to expand," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Marcus made it clear he'd be willing to make a fair offer for your place. More than fair, considering..." "Considering what?" Clara's voice carried a sharp edge that made Bill shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Considering the circumstances, Clara, you know as well as I do that this ranch needs more work than one person can handle. Marcus has the men and the money to make it productive again. And you, well, you could take the money and set yourself up comfortable in town. No more worrying about payments or repairs or living," Clara finished for him. "You want me to stop living, is that it?" Bill's face reddened. "Now, Clara, that's not fair. We just want what's best for you. Thomas wouldn't want you struggling like this." The mention of her husband's name hit Clara like a physical blow, but she straightened her shoulders and met Bill's eyes with a steady gaze. "Thomas would want me to fight for what's ours. He'd want me to find a way to make this work." "How, Clara? How are you going to make it work? You've got no cattle, no hired help, and the bank breathing down your neck. The mortgage payment is due in 2 months, and we both know you don't have the money." The truth of his words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket, but instead of smothering her resolve, it seemed to strengthen something deep inside her chest. She thought about the auction, about the men who would offer themselves for hire, and suddenly an idea began to take shape, crazy, desperate, but somehow right. "Maybe I do have a way," she said quietly. Bill leaned forward, hope flickering in his eyes. "You're thinking about Marcus's offer? I'm thinking about the auction." The hope died. "Clara, you don't have money to hire help. Even if you could afford a man for a month, what would it accomplish? You need cattle, equipment, feed." "I need someone who believes this place is worth saving," Clara interrupted. "Someone who's willing to work for more than just wages." Bill stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "Clara, listen to yourself. You're talking about hiring some drifter, some man you don't know from Adam, to come live on your property. It's not safe, it's not practical, and it's not going to solve your problems." But Clara wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was already moving ahead, calculating the money she had left her small savings, the few dollars from selling Thomas's tools, the emergency fund she'd hidden in the coffee tin behind the flour. It wasn't much, but it might be enough for one desperate gamble. "I appreciate your concern, Bill," she said, standing up to signal that the conversation was over. "But this is still my ranch, and these are still my decisions to make." Bill rose reluctantly, his expression troubled. "Clara, I've known you for a long time, and I've never seen you make a foolish choice. Don't start now." After he left, Clara sat back down in the rocking chair and allowed herself to really consider what she was thinking. The labor auction drew all kinds of men, some reliable, some not. Most were honest workers looking for a fair wage, but there were always a few who were running from something, men with hard faces and harder histories. She thought about the stories she'd heard over the years, whispered tales of gunfighters and outlaws who sometimes showed up at the auctions under assumed names. The respectable ranchers avoided such men, preferring to hire familiar faces or men with references. But Clara didn't have the luxury of being choosy. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara made her way to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, where Thomas rested beneath a simple wooden cross. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. "I don't know if I'm being brave or foolish, Thomas," she whispered, "but I can't just give up. This place is our life's work, our legacy. There has to be a way to save it." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, and for a moment Clara could almost hear Thomas's voice telling her to trust her instincts, to fight for what mattered most. That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a pencil and paper, making careful calculations. She had $47.30 enough, perhaps, to bid on someone the bigger ranchers overlooked. The auction was in 3 days, and every wealthy spread within 50 miles would be there looking for experienced hands. But Clara wasn't looking for experience. She was looking for something else entirely, someone who needed a second chance as desperately as she did, someone who might see in her failing ranch the same possibility that she saw. It was a dangerous gamble, trusting a stranger with not just her property, but her safety. Yet somehow, sitting in the kitchen where she'd shared so many meals with Thomas, Clara felt more certain than she had in months. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the world around her. Clara dressed carefully in her best dress, the blue one Thomas had always loved, and pinned up her silver hair with special care. She slipped Thomas's ring onto a chain around her neck, where it would rest close to her heart, and picked up the small cloth purse that contained her life savings. The ride to town felt like a journey to a different world. Clara had hitched up the old mare to the buggy, and with each mile, the certainty in her chest grew stronger. By the time she reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, she could hear the sounds of the auction men's voices, horses nickering, the auctioneer's practiced chant. She was going to change her life today, one way or another. The question was whether she'd find salvation or ruin waiting for her in that dusty corral. The auction corral buzzed with activity under the harsh morning sun. Clara parked her buggy at the edge of the crowd, her hands trembling slightly as she secured the reins. The familiar faces of Dry Creek's prominent ranchers filled the front rows of makeshift benches. Marcus Hartwell, with his cold, calculating eyes, the Peterson brothers, who owned the largest spread in the county, and a dozen others who commanded respect and wielded influence with equal measure. She recognized the pattern immediately. The wealthy buyers sat close to the auctioneer's platform, their hired foreman beside them with notebooks and knowing looks. They would bid on the skilled ranch hands, the men with proven track records and glowing references. The desperate men, the ones with questionable pasts or no references at all, would go cheap or not at all. Clara made her way through the crowd, nodding politely to neighbors who seemed surprised to see her there. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house touched her arm with false sympathy. "Clara, dear, what brings you out here today? Surely you're not thinking of—" "Just watching, Mrs. Patterson," Clara replied evenly, continuing toward an empty spot on a back bench. The men for hire stood in groups near the corral fence, some chatting nervously, others maintaining stoic silence. Clara studied each face, looking for something she couldn't quite name. Most appeared exactly as expected: weathered cowboys, farm hands between jobs, a few young men seeking adventure on the frontier. Then she saw him. Eli Boone stood apart from the others, leaning against the far corner of the corral fence with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his worn cotton shirt. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, giving him the appearance of a man who had seen violence and survived it. But it was his eyes that caught Clara's attention. While the other men looked around nervously or tried to catch the attention of potential employers, Eli stared straight ahead with a quiet dignity that seemed untouchable. He wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't trying to sell himself. He simply stood there, patient and still, like a man waiting for whatever came next without fear or expectation. The auctioneer, a thin man named Harvey Bosworth, climbed onto his platform and called for attention. "Gentlemen, ladies, welcome to our spring labor auction. As always, we'll start with our most experienced hands and work our way through. Remember, you're bidding on contracts that include room, board, and agreed-upon wages for the duration specified." The first man called up was Jake Morrison, a reliable cowhand who'd worked for various ranches over the years. The bidding was brisk and civilized, with Marcus Hartwell ultimately winning Jake's services for the season at $45. One by one, the men were called forward. The skilled workers went quickly to the highest bidders, while the less experienced commanded smaller sums. Clara watched the process with growing anxiety, her small purse feeling heavier with each passing minute. "Next up, we have Eli Boone," Harvey announced, consulting his list. "No local references, but he's asking for seasonal work." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clara could hear snippets of conversation around her. "Look at the size of him. Wonder what he's running from. Wouldn't want to meet him in a dark alley." Eli walked to the center of the corral with unhurried steps, his expression unchanged. He stood there calmly, while Harvey rattled off the standard terms, seemingly unbothered by the whispers and stares. "What's your experience, Boon?" Marcus Hartwell called out. "Cattle, horses, general ranch work," Eli replied, his voice deep and measured. "I can handle whatever needs doing." "Where'd you work last?" "Colorado Territory. Before that, Kansas." "Got references?" Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, sir." The silence that followed spoke volumes. In a business built on trust and reputation, a man without references was damaged goods. Clara could see the calculation in the buyers' faces. Was the risk worth whatever bargain price they might get? "I'll start the bidding at $5, Harvey announced, his voice notably less enthusiastic than it had been for the previous men. Silence. Clara's heart pounded as she watched Eli standing in the center of the corral, his dignity intact despite the obvious rejection. $5 for a season's work was insulting, barely enough to cover basic provisions. "Come now, gentlemen," Harvey cajoled. "Look at the size of this fellow. He could do the work of two smaller men." Still no takers. Clara could see the subtle shifts in Eli's posture, the way his shoulders straightened as if preparing for the blow of going unhired. Some of the men in the corral occasionally went without buyers, forced to move on to the next town and try again. $5, anyone? How about $3? The humiliation was palpable. Clara felt it as acutely as if she was standing in that corral herself, exposed and unwanted. She knew exactly how it felt to be judged insufficient, to have people look through you as if you weren't quite there. "I'll bid $5. The words left Clara's mouth before she fully realized she'd spoken. Every head in the crowd turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their astonishment like a physical force. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Did you say $5? Harvey asked, clearly uncertain he'd heard correctly. Clara stood up, her legs unsteady but her voice growing stronger. $5 for Mr. Boone's services." The murmur that ran through the crowd was different, now shocked, disapproving, filled with the kind of concern usually reserved for people who'd lost their minds. Clara could feel their stares, their judgment, their pity mixing with disapproval. "Clara, what are you doing?" Marcus Hartwell's voice cut through the whispers. "You can't seriously be thinking of hiring—" $6, Clara said firmly, cutting him off. For the first time since entering the corral, Eli turned his head to look directly at her. Their eyes met across the dusty space, and Clara saw something flicker in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. He studied her with the same careful attention she'd been giving him, taking in her silver hair, her worn but respectable dress, her steady gaze that refused to waver despite the crowd's reaction. "Ma'am," Harvey said carefully, "are you certain you understand what you're bidding on? This is for seasonal ranch work, heavy labor. I understand perfectly, Clara replied. $7. This is ridiculous, someone muttered behind her. That woman has no business hiring a man like that. Clara, think about what you're doing, Mrs. Patterson hissed. You don't know anything about this man. He could be dangerous. But Clara wasn't listening to the voices around her anymore. She was watching Eli's face, seeing the way he held himself with quiet dignity, even in this moment of public scrutiny. There was something in his eyes that spoke to her, not desperation or gratitude, but a kind of respectful acknowledgement, as if he recognized in her the same quality she saw in him. "Any other bidders?" Harvey asked, though his tone suggested he thought the entire proceeding had gone quite mad enough already. The silence stretched long enough for Clara to hear her own heartbeat. Then Harvey brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. "Sold to Mrs. Clara Hensley for $7. The crowd erupted in whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. Clara made her way down to the corral fence, her legs feeling stronger with each step. She was aware of the stares, the whispered concerns about her sanity and safety, but none of it seemed to matter now. Eli approached the fence where she waited, moving with the careful grace of a large man who had learned to be mindful of his size. Up close, Clara could see that his eyes were a deep brown, and despite the harsh planes of his face, there was intelligence there, and something else, a watchfulness that suggested he missed very little. "Ma'am," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Hensley," Clara replied. "Clara Hensley. Thank you, Mrs. Hensley." The words were quiet, spoken without the effusive gratitude she might have expected. Instead, there was dignity in his thanks, as if he understood that what had just happened was significant for both of them. "Can you ride?" Clara asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Then follow me home. We'll discuss the particulars there." As Clara walked back toward her buggy, she could feel the weight of every stare, hear every whispered speculation about her judgment and safety. Marcus Hartwell stepped into her path, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "Clara, this is madness. You don't know anything about this man. Let me buy out your bid. I'll give you $10 right now, and you can walk away from this mistake." Clara looked up at Marcus, this man who wanted to buy her ranch for a fraction of its worth, who had never seen her as anything more than an obstacle to his expansion plans. "No, thank you, Marcus. I believe I've made a fair deal." "A fair deal? Clara, look at him. He's clearly running from something. Men don't end up at these auctions without references unless they have something to hide." Clara glanced back at Eli, who was collecting his few possessions from beside the corral. His movements were economical, purposeful, and she noticed that he kept one eye on the crowd around him, not nervous, but alert. "Maybe he is running from something," Clara said quietly. "But then again, so am I." Marcus stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "Running from what? From common sense? From becoming invisible," Clara replied. "From accepting that my life is over because I'm a widow of a certain age, from letting other people decide what I'm capable of." She left Marcus standing there and climbed into her buggy. Behind her, she could hear Eli mounting his horse, a sturdy bay that had seen better days but appeared well cared for. As they rode out of town together, Clara was acutely aware of the picture they must make the small, silver-haired widow and the enormous, dangerous-looking cowboy riding side by side down the dusty road. For the first time in 2 years, Clara felt truly alive. The ride to the ranch passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the creak of Clara's buggy wheels and the steady rhythm of Eli's horse behind her. Clara found herself stealing glances back at her new hired hand, trying to reconcile his intimidating appearance with the quiet respectfulness he'd shown at the auction. He rode with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle, his large frame somehow in perfect harmony with his mount. When they reached the ranch, Clara pulled up near the house and climbed down from her buggy. Eli dismounted as well, his eyes already surveying the property with a practiced gaze that seemed to catalogue every detail: the sagging fence posts, the barn door hanging askew on its hinges, the overgrown weeds choking the vegetable garden. "It's not much to look at right now," Clara said, following his gaze with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "My husband Thomas maintained it beautifully, but since his passing—" She let the sentence trail off, unwilling to voice her own inadequacies. "Good bones," Eli said simply, his deep voice carrying no judgment. "Land's got good bones. Rest is just work." The phrase sent a jolt through Clara's chest. Thomas had said almost exactly the same thing 30 years ago, standing in this very spot as a young man with dreams of building something lasting. She studied Eli's profile as he continued his assessment, wondering what he saw when he looked at her failing ranch. "The barn's where you'll sleep," Clara said, leading him across the yard. "It's not fancy, but it's dry, and there's a small room in the back with a cot. My husband used it during calving season when he needed to stay close to the animals." Eli nodded and followed her into the barn. The interior was dim and smelled of old hay and leather, with empty stalls lining one side and farm equipment gathering dust on the other. Clara opened the door to the small room at the back, revealing a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out toward the mountains. "This will do fine, ma'am," Eli said, setting his worn saddlebags on the bed. "I appreciate the privacy. There's a pump outside for washing, and I'll bring your meals to the house. Breakfast at sunrise, dinner at noon, supper at sunset. $7 includes room and board for the season, as agreed." Eli turned to face her, and Clara noticed again how his size filled the small room. In the dim light, his scarred face seemed less intimidating and more weathered, like a landscape shaped by experience. "Mrs. Hensley," he said carefully, "I want you to know what you did today took courage. I won't forget that." The unexpected acknowledgement caught Clara off guard. She'd been prepared for gratitude, even subservience, but not this quiet recognition of what her decision had cost her in the eyes of her community. "I made a business decision, Mr. Boone. Nothing more." "No, ma'am," Eli said softly. "It was more than that, and we both know it." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'll leave you to get settled. There's work to be done, and we'll start first thing tomorrow." She turned to leave, but Eli's voice stopped her at the door. "Ma'am, what needs doing most urgent?" Clara paused, considering. The list of necessary repairs seemed endless, but one problem stood out above all others. The fence along the eastern pasture. It's been down since the winter storms, and without it, there's no point in getting cattle. "But Mr. Boone—" "Just Eli, ma'am." "Eli, then. That fence runs for nearly a mile, and some of the posts need to be completely replaced. It's back-breaking work, even for a strong man." Eli's expression didn't change. "I'll take a look at it first thing tomorrow, see what materials we'll need." After leaving him to settle in, Clara returned to the house and sat at her kitchen table, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd brought a complete stranger to live on her property, a man with no references, no history she could verify, and a presence that commanded both respect and wariness from everyone who saw him. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded remarkably like Mrs. Patterson, whispered warnings about foolish old women who made dangerous decisions. But underneath the anxiety was something else, a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing her problems alone. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn and found Eli already outside, examining the broken gatepost that marked the entrance to the eastern pasture. He'd found Thomas's tool shed and laid out an impressive array of implements: post-hole diggers, hammers, wire cutters, and coils of barbed wire that had been gathering dust for 2 years. "Morning!" Clara called out, carrying a plate of biscuits and bacon along with a steaming cup of coffee. "Morning, ma'am." Eli straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "This post here's rotted clean through at the base. Whole section's been carrying weight it shouldn't." Clara looked at the gatepost, seeing for the first time how the wood had turned soft and dark where it entered the ground. Thomas would have noticed this immediately, would have replaced it before it could fail and take down the surrounding fence. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. "Can be replaced," Eli corrected. Need to dig it out, set a new post, restring the wire. Take most of the day just for this section. He accepted the breakfast plate with a nod of thanks and ate standing up, his eyes never leaving the fence line. Clara found herself studying his hands as he worked large and collused, but careful in their movements. When he picked up the post-hole diggers, the heavy tools looked almost delicate in his grip. "You don't have to watch me work, ma'am," Eli said without looking up from where he'd begun to dig around the rotted post. "Got to be things in the house that need your attention." Clara bristled slightly at the dismissal, then realized he was probably trying to be considerate. "I like to know what's happening on my own land," she said firmly. If Eli was surprised by her response, he didn't show it. He simply nodded and continued digging, the rhythm of his work steady and methodical. Clara watched as he worked the shovel around the post, loosening the packed earth with efficient motions that spoke of long experience. When the old post finally came free, Clara gasped at the extent of the rot. The bottom third was completely blackened and soft, crumbling in Eli's hands as he lifted it from the hole. "Been failing for months," Eli observed. "Good thing you didn't try to run cattle through here. Whole fence might have come down." The comment was matter of fact, without criticism, but Clara felt the sting of her own ignorance. Thomas would have known. Thomas would have seen the problem and fixed it before it became a crisis. "I don't know much about maintaining fences," Clara admitted. "Thomas handled all the heavy work." Eli paused in his digging and looked up at her. "Every rancher's got their strengths. Some folks know cattle, some know horses, some know the business side. Fences are just one piece." "What's your strength?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. Eli was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I'm good at seeing what needs doing and getting it done. Not always pretty, but it holds." As the morning progressed, Clara found herself drawn back to watch Eli work, despite his earlier suggestion that she had other things to do. There was something mesmerizing about his methodical approach, the way he measured twice before cutting, how he tested the stability of each post before moving to the next section. When he stripped off his shirt in the heat of the midday sun, Clara caught sight of more scars across his back and shoulders, not the random marks of hard ranch work, but deliberate patterns that spoke of violence survived. She quickly looked away, but not before wondering what kind of life had marked him so thoroughly. "Mrs. Hensley," Eli called out during his afternoon break. "This wire here's been cut." Clara hurried over to where he stood examining a section of fence about 50 yards from the gate. The wire hung loose, its ends clean and sharp where they'd been severed. "Cut!" Clara repeated, her stomach clenching with sudden understanding. "Yes, ma'am. Recently, too, no rust on the cut ends." Eli's voice had taken on a harder edge. "Someone's been driving cattle through here, using your land as a shortcut to somewhere else." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. Cattle rustlers were a constant threat in the territory, and isolated ranches like hers were easy targets. Without Thomas's presence to deter trespassers, her land had become a highway for anyone wanting to move stolen cattle without being seen. "What do we do?" Clara asked, hating the way her voice wavered. Eli was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for signs of the intruders. "We fix the fence," he said finally. "Make it clear this land isn't open for business anymore, and we stay alert. Are they likely to come back?" "Depends on what they're moving and how regular their operation is." Eli's gaze met hers steadily. "But Mrs. Hensley, you should know if they've been using this route regular-like, they're not going to appreciate finding it blocked." Clara felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. She'd hired Eli to help save her ranch, but she was beginning to realize that salvation might come with dangers she hadn't anticipated. Looking at his scarred hands as he worked to repair the cut fence, she wondered if those dangers were exactly why fate had brought Eli Boone to her auction. 3 days into Eli's employment, Clara found herself establishing routines she hadn't realized she'd missed. Each morning, She prepared breakfast before dawn and carried it out to wherever Eli was working. He was always up before her, having already assessed the day's tasks and begun the heaviest labor while the air was still cool. On this particular morning, Clara loaded her best china onto a tray, her mother's delicate blue and white dishes that had made the journey west in a carefully packed crate 35 years ago. She'd been eating off everyday plates since Thomas's death, saving the good china for special occasions that never seemed to come. But something about Eli's quiet dignity made her want to honor their shared meals with a touch of ceremony. She found him in the barn, repairing the door that had been hanging crooked for months. He'd rigged a clever system of ropes and pulleys to support the heavy wooden door while he worked on the bent hinges, and Clara paused to admire the ingenuity of his solution. "That's quite a contraption," she said, setting the tray on a hay bale nearby. Eli looked up from where he was filing down a bent pin. "Sometimes you've got to work with what you have instead of what you wish you had." Clara handed him the china plate laden with eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. She noticed how carefully he accepted it, his large hands gentle with the delicate porcelain. "This is beautiful work," he said, examining the intricate blue pattern. "Looks like it came from back east. My mother's," Clara replied, pleased that he'd noticed. "She brought it from Pennsylvania when she married my father. Said a woman should have one beautiful thing, no matter how far from civilization she found herself." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "Wise woman. Beauty matters, especially in hard places." The comment surprised Clara with its insight. Most of the ranch hands she'd known over the years had been practical men who saw little value in anything that couldn't be used or eaten. But Eli handled her mother's china with the reverence of someone who understood that some things were valuable beyond their utility. "You have good manners for a cowboy," Clara observed. A shadow flickered across Eli's face. "Had a good teacher once." He didn't elaborate, and Clara sensed this was territory not meant for casual conversation. Instead, she settled onto a nearby crate and watched him work while they ate in companionable silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," Clara said finally, "about the cut fence and people not appreciating us, blocking their route." Eli's hands stilled on his work. "And Thomas kept a rifle. I know how to use it. Do you now?" There was no condescension in his voice, just genuine interest. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said any woman living on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself. Thomas and I used to hunt together in the early years." Clara paused, remembering happier times. "I haven't touched the gun since Thomas died, but I imagine it's like riding a horse, something you don't forget." Eli set down his file and looked at her directly. "Knowing how to shoot and being willing to shoot at a person are two different things, Mrs. Hensley." "I know that," Clara replied quietly. "But this is my home, and I won't be run off by cattle thieves or anyone else." Something shifted in Eli's expression, a recognition perhaps, or approval. "Where do you keep the rifle?" "In the house. Thomas built a case for it above the fireplace. Might be wise to keep it closer to hand for a while. Not loaded, mind you, but accessible." "Mind you," Clara nodded, though the thought of living with a weapon at the ready made her stomach clench. "Are you expecting trouble?" "I'm expecting to be prepared if trouble comes looking," Eli corrected. "There's a difference." After breakfast, Clara returned to the house and retrieved Thomas's rifle from its case. The Winchester felt heavier than she remembered, its wooden stock smooth from years of use. She checked the action, pleased to find that her muscle memory remained intact, then carried it to the kitchen and leaned it against the wall beside the door. The sight of the weapon in her peaceful kitchen should have been jarring, but instead, Clara found it oddly comforting. For too long, she'd felt helpless in the face of her mounting problems. The rifle represented something different, the possibility of taking active control of her circumstances. She spent the morning working in her neglected vegetable garden, pulling weeds and preparing the soil for late spring planting. The physical labor felt good after months of fretting over problems she couldn't solve with her own hands. From the garden, She could hear the steady rhythm of Eli's work and occasionally catch glimpses of him moving around the property. By afternoon, the barn door hung straight and true, swinging smoothly on its repaired hinges. Clara watched Eli test the mechanism several times, adjusting and fine-tuning until the massive door moved with surprising ease. "That's remarkable," Clara said, running her hand along the smooth arc of the door's swing. "Thomas struggled with that door for years." "Sometimes a problem just needs fresh eyes," Eli replied, coiling up his rope system. "Your husband was probably trying to fix the symptom instead of the cause." Clara considered this. Thomas had indeed focused on the hinges, repeatedly trying to force them back into alignment. But Eli had noticed that the real problem was the door frame itself, which had shifted over time and put stress on the hardware. "You see things differently than most people," Clara observed. "Comes from moving around a lot," Eli said. "You learn to read a situation quick when you're always the new man." "Is that what you are? The new man?" Eli paused in his cleanup. "I suppose that depends on whether I'm planning to stay put. Are you?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications Clara hadn't intended. She found herself holding her breath as Eli considered his answer. "I'm here for the season, Mrs. Hensley. That was our agreement." It wasn't quite an answer to her question, but Clara let it stand. She was beginning to understand that Eli revealed himself in layers, and pushing for information would likely drive him deeper into reserve. That evening, Clara prepared supper with unusual care, roasting a chicken and making fresh bread with honey from her own beehives. She set the table with her mother's china again, adding a jar of wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow beyond the garden. When Eli knocked on the kitchen door at sunset, Clara felt a flutter of nervousness she hadn't experienced in years. She'd been eating alone for so long that the prospect of sharing a proper meal with another person seemed both wonderful and terrifying. "Come in," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. Eli entered and stopped short at the sight of the set table. He'd cleaned up after his day's work, his hair still damp from washing and his shirt fresh, though patched in several places. "Mrs. Hensley, you didn't need to go to such trouble." "It's no trouble," Clara replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "Please, sit down." They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, the sounds of cutlery on china mixing with the evening chorus of crickets outside. Clara found herself stealing glances at Eli, noting how he held his knife and fork with practiced ease, despite his rough appearance. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Eli said finally. "Maybe years." "Thank you. It's nice to cook for someone who appreciates it. Your husband was a lucky man." The comment was simple and sincere, without any of the awkwardness that usually accompanied mentions of Thomas. Clara felt a warm flush of pleasure at the compliment. "I was the lucky one," she replied. "Thomas was a good man, patient, kind, hard-working, everything a woman could want in a husband." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "You can tell a lot about a man by how his widow speaks of him. What can you tell about Thomas?" "That he knew what he had and treated it right. That's rarer than it should be." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected insight. "He did know. Even after 30 years, he'd still bring me wildflowers from the meadow. Said a woman deserved to have beautiful things, especially when she made everything around her more beautiful." "Sounds like your mother and your husband understood each other," Eli observed. Clara smiled through her tears. "They did. Thomas said that's how he knew I was the right woman for him. Any woman raised by a mother with such wisdom was worth waiting for." As the evening light faded, Clara lit the oil lamp on the table, casting a warm glow over their shared meal. In the gentle light, Eli's harsh features seemed softer, more approachable. The scar on his face became just another line in a weathered landscape rather than a mark of violence. "Can I ask you something, Eli?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why didn't you have references? In all my years around ranch hands, I've never met one who couldn't provide some kind of recommendation." Eli was quiet for so long that Clara began to think she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested old pain. Sometimes a man's past doesn't recommend him for the kind of life he's trying to build, he said carefully. Sometimes starting over means leaving everything behind, including the people who might vouch for who you used to be. Clara studied his face in the lamplight, seeing beneath the careful words to the man who spoke them. Who were you before, Eli? Someone who made mistakes, he replied simply. Someone who's trying to do better. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. Clara reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. We all have things we wish we could change, she said softly. The question is, what we do with the chances we're given to start fresh. Eli's eyes met hers in the lamplight, and Clara saw something there that made her breath catch a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or simply two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. Thank you, Mrs. Hensley, he said quietly, for the meal and for understanding. Thank you for staying, Clara replied, for helping me believe this place can be saved. Outside, the evening wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. For the first time since Thomas's death, Clara felt truly at peace. 2 weeks after the auction, Clara stood on her front porch watching Eli guide a small herd of cattle through the eastern gate he'd repaired. The sight of livestock on her land again brought tears to her eyes. She'd forgotten how right it looked, how complete the ranch seemed with cattle dotting the pasture. The animals were strays Eli had found scattered along the creek bottom, apparently separated from a larger herd during the spring roundup. By territorial law, unclaimed cattle found on private land belonged to the landowner after 30 days, and Eli had suggested they pen them and wait to see if anyone came looking. Smart thinking, Clara had agreed, though privately she suspected Eli knew more about these particular cattle than he was letting on. The animals were well fed and bore brands she didn't recognize, but Eli had handled them with the confidence of someone who understood their temperament. Now, watching him work the small herd with quiet efficiency, Clara felt a pride she hadn't experienced in years. The ranch was functioning again, even in this small way, and it was largely due to the man she'd impulsively hired against everyone's advice. Mrs. Hensley, a voice called from the road. Clara looked up to see her neighbor, Janet Morrison, approaching on horseback. Janet owned the small spread to the south and had been one of the few people to offer genuine help after Thomas's death, though her assistance had mostly taken the form of gentle suggestions that Clara sell out and move to town. Janet, Clara called back, walking out to meet her. What brings you by? Janet dismounted and tied her horse to the porch rail, her eyes immediately drawn to the cattle in the eastern pasture. I heard you'd hired someone from the auction, but I didn't believe it until now. Clara, tell me you haven't really brought a complete stranger to live on your property. His name is Eli Boone, and he's doing excellent work, Clara replied evenly. Clara, honey, look at those cattle. Those aren't your animals. They're strays Eli found on my land, perfectly legal to hold them until someone claims them. Janet's expression grew troubled. Those aren't strays, Clara. I recognize that brand. It belongs to the Rocking M outfit from over in Devil's Canyon. Those cattle were reported stolen 2 weeks ago. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Stolen? A whole herd, Clara. The sheriff's been looking for them, and now they're on your land with that man you hired. Janet's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Clara, what do you really know about Eli Boone? Before Clara could answer, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Eli rode up from the pasture, his expression calm but alert as he took in the scene. Clara's pale face, Janet's obvious agitation, and the tension crackling between them. Ladies, he said, touching his hat brim as he dismounted. Mr. Boone, Janet replied stiffly. I was just telling Clara about those cattle you found. Eli's eyes moved between the two women, and Clara could see him reading the situation with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. What about them, ma'am? They belong to the Rocking M. They were stolen 2 weeks ago. If Eli was surprised by this information, he didn't show it. That's so, You don't seem very concerned about being in possession of stolen livestock, Janet observed, her voice sharp with suspicion. I'm concerned about doing the right thing, Eli replied quietly. Mrs. Hensley, if these cattle are stolen property, we need to contact the sheriff immediately. Clara studied Eli's face, searching for any sign of deception or worry. Instead, she saw the same steady honesty he'd shown since arriving at her ranch. Of course. Janet, would you mind riding to town and asking Sheriff Rawlings to come out? We'll keep the cattle penned until he can sort this out. Janet looked between Clara and Eli with obvious frustration. Clara, I don't think you should be alone here with... I'll be fine, Janet. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. After Janet reluctantly departed, Clara and Eli walked toward the house in silence. Clara's mind raced with implications and fears. If Eli had knowingly brought stolen cattle to her ranch, she could be charged as an accessory. If he was involved with cattle rustlers, her life could be in danger. Mrs. Hensley, Eli said as they reached the porch, I want you to know I found those cattle scattered along the creek bottom, just like I said. I didn't know they were stolen. Clara stopped and turned to face him. But you suspected something, didn't you? That's why you suggested waiting to see if anyone claimed them. Eli was quiet for a moment. I suspected they didn't wander off on their own. Cattle don't usually separate from a herd and end up in such good condition, but I didn't know they were stolen, and I didn't know whose brand they carried. Why didn't you tell me your suspicions? Because I wanted to see what developed. If rustlers had been using your land as a route, finding their cattle here might flush them out. Clara stared at him. You used my ranch as bait? I used stolen cattle as bait, Eli corrected. Your ranch just happened to be where they ended up, without telling me, without asking if I was willing to take that risk. Eli's jaw tightened. You're right. I should have told you. But Mrs. Hensley, these rustlers have been using your land, whether we acknowledge it or not. At least this way, we might catch them at it. Before Clara could respond, they heard the thunder of approaching horses. A group of riders crested the hill, Sheriff Rawlings in the lead, followed by several men Clara didn't recognize, and one she wished she'd never seen again. Marcus Hartwell rode among them, his face grim with satisfaction. Clara! Sheriff Rawlings called out as the group approached. We need to talk about those cattle. Clara walked out to meet them, acutely aware of Eli's presence beside her. She noticed how he positioned himself slightly behind and to her right, close enough to intervene if necessary, but not so close as to appear threatening. Sheriff, Clara said calmly, Janet Morrison said these cattle were reported stolen. We're ready to cooperate fully with your investigation. I'm sure you are, Clara, Marcus interrupted before the sheriff could speak. But the question is whether your hired man here is equally cooperative. Sheriff Rawlings shot Marcus a warning look. Let me handle this, Marcus. He turned to Eli. You must be Eli Boone. I'm Sheriff Rawlings. I understand you found these cattle on Mrs. Hensley's property. Yes, sir. Scattered along the creek bottom about a week ago. Penned them to see if anyone would come looking. One of the strangers, a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his vest, spoke up. I'm Deputy Marshal Tom Fletcher. Those cattle belong to the Rockingham Ranch in Devil's Canyon. They were stolen along with 60 head 2 weeks ago during a raid on their winter pasture. Any idea who took them? Eli asked. Working on it, Fletcher replied, studying Eli with sharp eyes. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Mr. Boone? I know what I told you, found them on Mrs. Hensley's land and penned them. Mighty convenient, Marcus said. Man with no references shows up, and suddenly stolen cattle appear on Clara's property. Clara felt anger flare in her chest. Marcus Hartwell, you have no business. I have every business, Marcus interrupted. This affects the whole community. We can't have cattle thieves operating in our territory. Mr. Hartwell's right about that, Deputy Fletcher agreed, which is why I need to ask you some questions, Mr. Boone, starting with where you were 2 weeks ago. Vist? Eli's expression didn't change. 2 weeks ago, I was camped along Willow Creek, about 20 miles north of here. Stayed there 3 days before moving on to Dry Creek for the auction. Anyone who can verify that? No, sir. I was traveling alone. Clara watched the exchange with growing unease. Eli's answers were straightforward and honest-sounding, but she could see the suspicion in the lawmen's faces. A man with no alibi and no references made an easy target for accusations. "Mrs. Hensley," Sheriff Rawlings said, his voice gentle but official, "I'm going to need you to stay away from Mr. Boone until we sort this out, just as a precaution." "Absolutely not," Clara replied firmly. "Eli is my employee, working on my land under a legal contract. Unless you're charging him with something, he stays." "Clara, be reasonable," Marcus pleaded. "This man could be dangerous." "This man has been nothing but respectful and hard-working since I hired him," Clara shot back. "Unlike some people who seem more interested in gossip than facts." Deputy Fletcher held up a hand. "Let's all calm down. Mr. Boone, I'm not arresting you, but I am asking you to remain available for further questioning. Don't leave the county without checking with me first." "Yes, sir." "And Mrs. Hensley, while I can't force you to dismiss Mr. Boone, I strongly advise caution. Cattle rustling is serious business, and the men involved don't hesitate to use violence." After the lawman left with the recovered cattle, Clara and Eli stood in the sudden quiet of the empty pasture. The ranch felt hollow again without the animals, and Clara realized how much hope she'd invested in that small herd. "I'm sorry," Eli said quietly. "I should have told you what I suspected." Clara looked at his profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Are you involved with those rustlers, Eli?" He turned to meet her eyes directly. "No, ma'am, I'm not." "Do you know who is?" "I have suspicions, but suspicions aren't evidence." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. What she saw instead was frustration, and something that looked like disappointment not in being suspected, but in having disappointed her. "I believe you," she said finally. Relief flickered across Eli's features. "Thank you. But Eli, no more secrets. If you suspect something, you tell me. This is my home, my life, and I won't be protected through ignorance." "Yes, ma'am. You have my word." As they walked back toward the house, Clara noticed a framed photograph sitting on the mantelpiece, a picture of her and Thomas, taken on their 20th wedding anniversary. They were standing in front of the house, both smiling, Thomas's arm around her waist and her hand resting on his chest. Eli paused in front of the photograph, studying it with respectful attention. "You were both very happy," he observed. "We were," Clara replied. "Thomas used to say that happiness wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you built together, day by day." Wise man, he was. Clara touched the frame gently. "I used to think that kind of happiness was something you could only have once in a lifetime. That losing it meant accepting that the best part of your life was over. And now?" Clara looked at Eli, this quiet man who had brought both hope and danger into her orderly world. "Now, I think maybe there are different kinds of happiness. Maybe what matters is staying open to the possibility." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of distant rain. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the weather was the least of the storms heading their way. 3 days after the cattle incident, Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she noticed Eli working on something in the barn with unusual secrecy. He'd been quieter than usual since the sheriff's visit, throwing himself into ranch work with an intensity that seemed driven by more than simple dedication. When she carried his afternoon meal to the barn, she found him kneeling beside his saddlebags, carefully wrapping something in an old piece of canvas. Her approach must have startled him because he quickly covered the object and stood up, his expression guarded. "Dinner," Clara said, setting the plate on a nearby hay bale. "Thank you, ma'am." Clara hesitated, then decided to address what she'd witnessed. "Eli, what were you wrapping up just now?" He was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he reached into the saddlebag and withdrew the canvas-wrapped bundle, setting it on the workbench between them. I was hoping I wouldn't need to show you this, he said quietly. Clara's heart began to race as Eli carefully unwrapped the canvas, revealing a well-maintained Colt revolver in a tooled leather holster. The weapon was clearly expensive, with intricate scrollwork on the grip and a barrel that gleamed with careful maintenance. "You're armed," Clara said, though it came out more as a statement than a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Have you been carrying that gun while working on my ranch?" "No, ma'am. It's been in my saddlebag since I arrived." Eli's voice was steady but tense. "But given recent events, I think it's time I started wearing it." Clara stared at the weapon, her mind racing with implications. The revolver wasn't the kind of gun a simple ranch hand would own. It was expensive, custom-made, the sort of weapon carried by someone who used it professionally. "That's not a working cowboy's gun," she said slowly. "No, ma'am, it's not." "Eli, who are you really?" He met her eyes with the same steady honesty he'd shown since arriving at her ranch, but now Clara could see deeper currents, old pain, carefully controlled fear, and something that looked like resignation. "I told you I made mistakes in my past," he said quietly. "This gun is part of that past." "What kind of mistakes?" Eli was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old regrets. "I used to make my living with this gun, not as an outlaw, as a hired gun for cattlemen's associations, mining companies, people who needed problems solved and weren't too particular about methods." Clara felt her world shift slightly. "You were a gunfighter." "I was a killer," Eli corrected bluntly. "Legal, sanctioned, but still a killer. I told myself I was on the right side, protecting honest folks from rustlers and claim jumpers. Took me years to realize that the men hiring me weren't always as honest as they claimed." "What changed?" "I was hired to clear some homesteaders off land that a mining company wanted, families who'd been farming there for years, who had legal claims and nowhere else to go." Eli's jaw tightened. "The company told me they were squatters, troublemakers who were stealing valuable resources. I believed them because it was easier than asking hard questions." Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. "When I got there, I found out the truth. These were good people, farmers, a school teacher, a preacher, and his family. The mining company just wanted them gone so they could strip the land without witnesses." Eli's voice grew quieter. "I was supposed to intimidate them, make them want to leave. Instead, I found myself helping them prepare to defend their homes." "What happened?" "The company sent other men when I refused to do the job. I ended up in a gunfight, protecting people I'd been hired to drive off." Eli touched the scar on his face. "Got this for my trouble, along with a bounty on my head and a reputation as a turncoat." Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle man who'd been working her ranch with the dangerous gunfighter he described. "Is that why you have no references? Because you turned against your employers?" "Partly. Also because the kind of references I could get wouldn't help me find honest work. Men don't usually hire killers to fix their fences." "But you're not that man anymore." "I'm trying not to be," Eli replied. "But Mrs. Hensley, you need to understand the skills don't go away. The reflexes, the instincts, the ability to read violence before it happens. Once you've lived that life, it stays with you." Clara looked at the gun again, seeing it now not as a threat, but as a burden Eli carried. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because whoever's been rustling cattle around here isn't going to appreciate us interfering with their operation. And because—" Eli hesitated, then continued, "because if trouble comes to your ranch, you deserve to know that the man standing beside you has experience dealing with trouble." The admission hung between them, changing everything and nothing. Clara thought about the past 3 weeks, about Eli's careful respectfulness, his quiet competence, the way he'd brought dignity and purpose back to her struggling ranch. "Are you planning to leave?" she asked. "Do you want me to?" Clara considered the question seriously. Knowing what she now knew about Eli's past, the smart thing would be to send him away before his presence brought violence to her doorstep. But looking at his weathered face, seeing the man who'd repaired her fences and restored her hope, she found her answer. "I want you to stay," she said firmly, "but I want your promise that you'll never lie to me again." Relief flooded Eli's features. "You have it. And I want to know, are you expecting trouble to find you here?" "Not specifically, but trouble has a way of following men like me, whether we invite it or not." Clara nodded, accepting this harsh reality. "Then we'd better be prepared for it." That evening, as they shared another meal by lamplight, Clara found herself studying Eli with new eyes. The careful way he sat with his back to the wall, the way his gaze periodically swept the windows, the controlled precision of his movements, all of it made sense now. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said as they finished their coffee. "Of course." "That first day, when you were examining the ranch, you weren't just looking at what needed repair, were you? You were assessing it defensively." Eli nodded slowly. "Old habits. I was noting sightlines, cover, approaches, the kind of things that matter if you need to defend a position." "And your conclusion?" "The house sits well, good views in all directions, solid construction. The barn provides cover and storage. Creek gives water access that can't be cut off. If it came to defending this place," he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully, "it could be done." Clara felt a chill at how casually he discussed turning her peaceful ranch into a fortress, but she also felt oddly reassured. If trouble was coming, she couldn't ask for a better protector than a man who understood violence and had chosen to walk away from it. "Eli, can I see your gun?" He looked surprised, but reached for the weapon, checking to ensure it was unloaded before handing it to her. Clara hefted the revolver, surprised by its weight and the smoothness of its action. The grip was worn to fit a hand larger than hers, and the holster showed the kind of wear that came from daily use. "It's beautiful," she said, though the word felt strange applied to something designed for killing. "It's a tool," Eli replied quietly, "like a hammer or a saw. Beautiful tools work better, last longer, feel better in your hand, but they're still just tools." Clara handed the gun back to him. "Do you miss it? The life you left behind?" "No, ma'am. That life was about endings, stopping things, finishing them. This life," he gestured around the warm kitchen, "this is about beginnings, building things, making them grow. Even if it means giving up who you were. Especially if it means giving up who I was." Eli holstered the gun and set it aside. "Mrs. Hensley, I've spent years trying to wash the blood off my hands. Working your ranch, eating at your table, being treated like a decent man instead of a hired killer, it's the closest I've come to feeling clean." Clara reached across the table and covered his scarred hand with hers. "Then we'll make sure you get to keep feeling that way." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. Clara squeezed Eli's hand gently, wondering if either of them truly understood what they were promising each other in the lamplight of her kitchen. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she was part of something larger than her own grief and fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The wanted poster arrived on a Tuesday morning, nailed to the general store's bulletin board by someone who wanted to make sure the whole town would see it. Clara learned about it from Janet Morrison, who rode out to the ranch with her face pale and her hands shaking. "Clara, you need to see this," Janet said without preamble, thrusting a crumpled piece of paper at her. Clara unfolded the poster and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Staring back at her was a younger version of Eli's face, clean-shaven. Harder somehow, but unmistakably him. Above the photograph, bold letters proclaimed, "Wanted for murder, Eli Boone, 500 reward." "Murder?" Clara whispered. "3 men in Colorado Territory," Janet said, her voice tight with fear. "Clara, you've been harboring a killer." Clara's hands shook as she read the details. The poster claimed Eli had gunned down 3 men in cold blood during a dispute over mining claims. It listed him as armed and extremely dangerous, warning citizens not to approach him alone. "Where did this come from?" Clara asked. "Deputy Fletcher brought it this morning. He said a marshal from Colorado recognized the name when he heard about the cattle incident. "Clara, they're coming to arrest him." Clara stared at the poster, trying to reconcile the brutal killer it described with the gentle man who had been carefully tending her ranch for weeks. The photograph showed the same intelligent eyes, the same strong jaw, but there was a coldness in the younger Eli's expression that she'd never seen in person. "When are they coming?" Clara asked. "This afternoon. Clara, you need to get away from here. Come stay with me until they capture him." "No." The word came out stronger than Clara had intended. "What do you mean, no? Clara, this man is a murderer. This poster says he's wanted for murder. That's not the same thing." Janet stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Clara, listen to yourself. You're defending a man who's killed 3 people. "I'm defending a man who's shown me nothing but respect and kindness," Clara replied firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere until I hear his side of the story." Janet grabbed Clara's arm. "There is no other side to murder, Clara. Whatever spell this man has cast over you. No spell, Janet. Just common sense. The Eli Boone I know wouldn't kill 3 men in cold blood. If he killed them, he had a reason. You've known him for 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, he's proven himself to be honest, hard-working, and decent. That poster could be wrong, or outdated, or you could be a foolish old woman who's so lonely she's willing to overlook anything for a little male attention." The cruel words hit Clara like a physical blow. She saw immediately that Janet regretted them, but the damage was done. Clara straightened her shoulders and met her neighbor's eyes with icy dignity. "I think you should leave now, Janet." "Clara, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. And maybe you're right. Maybe I am a foolish old woman. But I'm a foolish old woman who keeps her word and doesn't abandon people based on gossip and accusations." After Janet left, Clara sat on her porch and studied the wanted poster again. The photograph had been taken at least 5 years ago, judging by Eli's appearance. 5 years was a long time, long enough for a man to change, to grow, to become someone different than he'd been. She thought about their conversations, about the way he'd spoken of his past mistakes and his desire to build something better. Was it possible that murder was among those mistakes? And if so, could she live with that knowledge? The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up to see Eli riding in from the south pasture, his posture relaxed and his face peaceful. Behind him, dust clouds on the horizon announced the arrival of the posse Janet had warned her about. Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She walked out to meet Eli, the wanted poster clutched in her hand. "Eli," she called, "we need to talk." He dismounted and approached her, his expression shifting to concern when he saw her face. "What's wrong, Mrs. Hensley?" Clara held out the poster. "This was posted in town this morning." Eli's face went completely still as he looked at the photograph of his younger self. Clara watched him read the accusations, saw the way his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists. "Mrs. Hensley," he began. "Did you kill those 3 men?" Clara interrupted. Eli met her eyes directly. "Yes." The simple honesty of his answer was somehow more shocking than if he'd tried to deny it. Clara felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to remain standing. "Why?" "Because they were about to rape and murder a family of homesteaders," Eli said quietly. "Because I was the only one there who could stop them." "Tell me what happened." Eli glanced toward the approaching dust cloud, then back at Clara. "The 3 men named on that poster were part of a group of claim jumpers working for a mining syndicate. They'd been terrorizing families in the area, driving them off valuable land through intimidation and violence. And you were hired to stop them?" "I was hired by the syndicate," Eli corrected. "I was supposed to be working with them, not against them. But when I saw what they were really doing, when I watched them burn out a family with small children and then laugh about it, I couldn't be part of it anymore." Clara could see the approaching riders now, close enough to make out individual faces. "What happened that day?" The three men on the poster decided to make an example of a preacher and his family. They were going to, Eli's voice caught. They were going to hurt the preacher's wife and daughter in front of him before they killed them all. I tried to talk them out of it, but they said I was either with them or against them. So you chose against them. I chose to protect innocent people. The fight lasted about 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 men were dead, and I had a price on my head. The posse was close enough now that Clara could see Deputy Fletcher in the lead, flanked by Sheriff Rawlings and several men she didn't recognize. They would be here in minutes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara asked. "Because I hoped it would never matter. Because I thought I could leave that life behind and become the man you believed me to be." Clara looked at the wanted poster again, then at Eli's face. The photograph showed a killer, but the man standing before her showed only regret and resignation. The preacher's family, were they saved? "Yes, ma'am. They testified at the hearing, but by then I was already gone. The mining syndicate had enough influence to make sure the official story painted me as the villain. And you've been running ever since." "Until I came here," Eli corrected, "until I found a reason to stop running." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Clara could hear Deputy Fletcher's voice calling out orders to surround the property. In moments, Eli would be in custody, facing charges for murders he'd committed in defense of innocence. Clara made another decision that surprised her. "Eli, do you trust me?" "With my life, ma'am." "Then put your gun on the ground and let them arrest you." Eli stared at her. "Ma'am, trust me," Clara repeated. "Put down your gun and surrender peacefully. Don't give them any excuse to hurt you." "Mrs. Hensley, they're not going to believe." "I believe you," Clara said firmly, "and I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." Eli looked at her for a long moment, then slowly unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the ground. "What are you planning to do?" "Whatever it takes," Clara replied. "You gave up killing for me, Eli. Now let me fight for you." The posse thundered into the yard, weapons drawn and voices shouting. Clara stepped between Eli and the approaching lawman, her small frame suddenly seeming larger than life. "Deputy Fletcher," she called out in a voice that carried across the yard, "Mr. Boone is surrendering peacefully. There's no need for violence." "Step away from him, Mrs. Hensley," Fletcher ordered. "This man is dangerous." "This man is under my protection," Clara replied, her voice ringing with authority. "And I have information about those murders that you need to hear." As the lawmen surrounded them, Clara kept her eyes on Eli's face. She saw gratitude there, and something else, hope, perhaps, that after years of running, he'd finally found someone willing to stand with him against the world. The wanted poster fluttered in the wind at her feet, but Clara no longer saw it as evidence of Eli's guilt. Instead, she saw it as proof that sometimes good men were forced to do terrible things, and that the difference between a hero and a villain often came down to who was telling the story. She was going to make sure the right story got told. The Dry Creek jailhouse hadn't seen this much activity in years. Clara sat in Sheriff Rawlings' office, Thomas's rifle across her lap, while Deputy Fletcher paced behind the desk and argued with someone through the telegraph key. Through the barred window, she could see Eli sitting calmly in his cell, reading a book she'd brought him from her own collection. "Mrs. Hensley, you can't stay here indefinitely," Sheriff Rawlings said for the 3rd time in an hour. "It's been 2 days. Go home, get some rest, and let us handle this." "I'm not leaving until I'm sure Eli gets a fair hearing," Clara replied. "And given that someone's been spreading lies about him being a cold-blooded killer, I'd say my presence here is necessary." Deputy Fletcher looked up from the telegraph with frustration written across his face. "The Colorado authorities are insisting these charges are legitimate. They want Boone extradited immediately." "What about the preacher's family he supposedly saved?" Clara asked. "Have you contacted them?" "We're trying to locate them, but it was 5 years ago. People move, records get lost." "Records don't get lost when someone wants them found," Clara interrupted. "What's the name of the preacher?" Fletcher consulted his notes reluctantly. "Reverend Samuel Morrison and his family, but Mrs. Hensley." Morrison? Clara's heart leaped. Janet Morrison mentioned that name. She said she had a brother who went to Colorado to start a church. Samuel Morrison. Fletcher stopped pacing. You think there's a connection? I think we'd better find out. Clara stood up, cradling Thomas's rifle. And I think we'd better do it quickly, because something tells me this arrest is just the beginning of our troubles. As if summoned by her words, the door burst open, and Marcus Hartwell strode in, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like fear. "Sheriff, we've got problems," Marcus announced without preamble. "Someone rustled 40 head from my north pasture last night, cut the fence clean, and drove them off like they knew exactly what they were doing." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The same night, Eli was arrested. "Mighty convenient coincidence," Marcus said, shooting a venomous look toward the cells. "Course, rustlers work in gangs. Just because we caught one doesn't mean we got them all." "Or," Clara said quietly, "it means we caught the wrong man entirely." Fletcher looked between them with growing understanding. "You think the arrest was a diversion?" "I think someone wanted Eli out of the way," Clara replied. "The question is why?" Before anyone could respond, the telegraph key began chattering urgently. Fletcher hurried to transcribe the message, his face growing pale as he read. "What is it?" Sheriff Rawlings demanded. "Message from Colorado Territory, the mining syndicate that filed the original charges against Boone. It was shut down 3 years ago for fraud and corruption. Most of the executives were arrested." Clara felt a surge of vindication. "What about the specific charges against Eli?" Fletcher continued reading. "Says here the case was reopened last year after new evidence came to light. The preacher's family came forward with testimony that Boone saved their lives. The territorial governor issued a full pardon." The room fell silent. Clara looked toward the cell where Eli sat, seeing his shoulders straighten as he overheard the news. "A pardon?" Marcus sputtered. "Then why is there still a wanted poster?" "Because," Clara said, the pieces suddenly clicking into place, "someone wanted us to think Eli was still a wanted man, someone who needed him discredited and removed." She turned to face Marcus, studying his face with new eyes. "Marcus, how exactly did you know about that wanted poster? It appeared awfully quickly after Eli was questioned about those stolen cattle." Marcus's face reddened. "I don't like what you're implying, Clara. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it outright. You've been trying to get my ranch for months. You've made it clear you think I should sell out and move to town. Having Eli around was making that harder, wasn't it? This is ridiculous, is it? A wanted poster appears right after stolen cattle show up on my land. Eli gets arrested, and the same night, more cattle get stolen from your spread. Except this time, the one man in the territory with the skills to track the real rustlers is sitting in jail." Sheriff Rawlings was watching the exchange with growing interest. "Marcus, where did you first see that wanted poster?" It was posted at the general store." "That's not what I asked. Where did you first see it?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed without sound. Clara could see the calculation in his eyes, the desperate search for a believable lie. "Someone brought it to me," he said finally. "Said they thought I should know what kind of man Clara had hired." "Who?" Sheriff Rawlings demanded. I don't remember exactly. One of the men from out of town." Deputy Fletcher looked up from another incoming telegraph message. "That's interesting, because this message says the original wanted posters were recalled 2 years ago when the investigation was reopened. Any poster circulating now would have to be a deliberate fake." Clara felt the truth crystallizing in her mind like ice forming on water. "Marcus, you've been working with the rustlers all along, haven't you? Using your position and influence to give them information, maybe even helping them move stolen cattle." "That's absurd, is it? You knew exactly which cattle to steal from your own herd. You knew when and where to do it for maximum effect. And you needed Eli out of the way because you recognized what he was, someone with the skills to track you down and expose your operation." Marcus's face had gone from red to white. "You can't prove any of this." "Maybe not yet," Clara replied. "But I'll bet if Sheriff Rawlings looks into who's been buying cattle without proper documentation, your name will come up. And I'll bet if he checks your recent financial records, he'll find some interesting deposits that don't match your ranch's legitimate income." The room fell silent, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. Clara could feel the weight of revelation settling over everyone present, changing the entire dynamic of the situation. "Sheriff," Eli's voice came from the cell, calm and measured. "If you'll release me, I can track whoever took Mr. Hartwell's cattle. Trails still fresh, and I know what to look for." "Absolutely not," Marcus said quickly. "This man is still dangerous." "This man has been officially pardoned," Fletcher interrupted, waving the latest telegraph message. "And given recent developments, I think we need his expertise more than we need him in a cell." Sheriff Rawlings looked from Clara to Marcus to the messages on Fletcher's desk. "Marcus, I'm going to need you to stay in town while we sort this out. And I mean stay, don't leave for any reason. You can't seriously be considering." "I'm considering that maybe we've been looking at this all wrong," Rawlings said firmly. "Deputy Fletcher, release Mr. Boone. Mrs. Hensley, I think you and Mr. Boone should go back to your ranch and stay alert. If there are rustlers still operating in the area, they might not be happy about Mr. Boone being free." As Fletcher unlocked Eli's cell, Clara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They'd cleared Eli's name, but in doing so, they'd also made enemies of whoever was really behind the cattle thefts. "Mrs. Hensley," Eli said as he emerged from the cell, "we need to talk about what comes next." Clara nodded, understanding that their troubles were far from over. "I know. Let's go home and make our plans." The ride back to the ranch was tense with unspoken understanding. They both knew that exposing Marcus's likely involvement in the rustling operation had painted targets on their backs. The real criminals would be desperate now, their cover blown and their profits threatened. As they approached the ranch house, Eli suddenly held up his hand, signaling Clara to stop. His entire body had gone alert, every instinct sharpened by years of reading danger. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Horse tracks in the yard. Fresh ones. Someone's been here while we were gone." Clara felt her heart begin to pound. "The rustlers? Maybe. Or maybe just someone looking around, seeing what we know." Eli dismounted carefully, his hand moving to where his gun would normally rest, before remembering it was still in evidence. "Mrs. Hensley, I need you to ride back toward town. Get help. I'm not leaving you. This isn't the time to be stubborn." "No," Clara said firmly, dismounting with Thomas's rifle in her hands. "This is my home, and I won't be run off by cattle thieves or anyone else." Eli looked at her determined face and seemed to recognize that arguing was futile. "Then stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" Clara nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of running anywhere. They approached the house carefully, Eli reading the signs in the dirt like words on a page. Clara could see where multiple horses had been tied near the porch, where boot prints led to the windows and around the building's perimeter. "They were looking for something," Eli said quietly. "Or someone." The front door stood slightly ajar, though Clara was certain she'd locked it before leaving for town. Eli motioned for her to wait while he checked the interior, moving with the silent grace of a predator despite his size. He emerged a few minutes later, his expression grim. "House has been searched. Professional job, they were careful not to destroy anything, but they went through everything." "What were they looking for?" "Evidence, maybe. Or information about what we know and who we've told." Eli's eyes swept the horizon, alert for any sign of watchers. "Mrs. Hensley, I think we need to consider that this isn't just about cattle rustling anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean someone's gone to a lot of trouble to discredit me and get me out of the way. That suggests this operation is bigger than just stealing a few head of cattle. And now that their plan has failed, they'll try something else," Clara finished. "Yes, ma'am. Something more direct." As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, coming fast from the direction of town. Clara felt her grip tighten on Thomas's rifle as she wondered if their enemies had decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "How many?" she asked. Eli was counting the dust clouds. 6, maybe 7. Too many for a social call. Clara looked at her peaceful ranch, at the home she'd shared with Thomas for 30 years, and felt a fierce determination settle in her chest. She'd lost too much already to let fear drive her away from what remained. "Eli," she said quietly, "remember what you said about this place being defensible?" "Yes, ma'am. I think it's time to find out if you were right." The approaching riders crested the hill with the purposeful urgency of men who had come to finish unpleasant business. Clara counted 7 horsemen, their faces hard and their weapons visible. These weren't lawmen or neighbors, they had the look of hired guns, the kind of men who solved problems with violence. "Mrs. Hensley," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced such moments before. "I need you to go to the root cellar behind the house. Take the rifle and stay there until this is over." "Absolutely not." "Ma'am, these men aren't here to talk. They're here to eliminate witnesses, and that includes you." Clara looked at the approaching riders, then at Eli's face. She could see the transformation happening in real time, the gentle ranch hand disappearing as the experienced gunfighter emerged. His posture changed, his movements became more economical, and his eyes took on the flat, calculating look of a man preparing for war. "If they're here to eliminate witnesses," Clara said firmly, "then running won't save me. They'll just hunt me down later." Besides, she raised Thomas's rifle with hands that were steadier than she felt. "This is my home. I have a right to defend it." Eli studied her face and seemed to recognize the futility of further argument. "Can you really shoot that thing?" "I told you my father taught me, and Thomas and I hunted together for years. I may be rusty, but I remember the basics." The riders were close enough now that Clara could make out individual faces. She didn't recognize any of them, but their leader, a lean man with silver hair and cold eyes, had the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "That'll be Wade Morrison," Eli said, noting her attention. "Janet's brother-in-law from her first marriage. He's been running cattle through Colorado and New Mexico territories for years, always one step ahead of the law." "How do you know that?" "Because I've been tracking his operation for months. That's really why I came to Dry Creek following leads that pointed to this area." Clara stared at him. "You're not just a reformed gunfighter. You're still working as a lawman." "Not officially, but the territorial marshal in Colorado asked me to look into reports of organized rustling in this region. Your ranch kept coming up as a possible way station for stolen cattle. And you thought I was involved?" "At first. Then I realized you were just an isolated target they were using without your knowledge." Eli's attention returned to the approaching riders. "Mrs. Hensley, if we survive this, I promise I'll explain everything. Right now, we need to focus on staying alive." The riders had formed a loose semicircle around the front of the house, just out of rifle range, but close enough to make their intentions clear. Wade Morrison rode forward a few yards, his hands visible but his gun within easy reach. "Mrs. Hensley!" he called out, his voice carrying the false politeness of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "We need to have a conversation." Clara stepped onto the porch, Thomas's rifle held in a ready position. "Then talk, Mr. Morrison, but keep your distance. I understand you've been having some trouble with cattle thieves," Morrison continued. "Terrible thing, good folks losing their livestock to criminals. Makes a person feel vulnerable, unsafe in their own home. Is that a threat?" "Just an observation, ma'am. The thing is, sometimes people see things they shouldn't see, or learn things that could cause problems for hard-working folks just trying to make a living." Clara felt anger flare in her chest. "Hard-working folks don't steal cattle or threaten widows." Morrison's false smile faded slightly. "Mrs. Hensley, you're a reasonable woman. I'm sure we can come to an understanding that benefits everyone. The only understanding I'm interested in is the one where you and your men turn around and ride away from my property." I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, your hired man there has been asking uncomfortable questions and poking his nose into business that doesn't concern him. That's created complications. Eli stepped into view beside Clara, his posture relaxed but ready. Morrison, I was wondering when you'd work up the courage to show yourself. Boon, Morrison's voice hardened. I hear you've been cleared of those murder charges. Pity. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble if they'd just hanged you in Colorado. Sorry to disappoint you. Oh, you won't be disappointing me much longer. Morrison gestured to his men, who began to spread out in a wider circle. See, the thing about witnesses is they tend to have accidents, tragic fires, falls from horses, that sort of thing. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as the true scope of their danger became clear. These men weren't just cattle thieves. They were killers who eliminated anyone who threatened their operation. Mrs. Hensley, Morrison called out, last chance to be reasonable. Send Boone out here and we'll make this quick and clean. Refuse, and well, accidents can be messy affairs. Clara looked at Eli, seeing the grim acceptance in his eyes. He'd faced odds like this before and knew exactly how it was likely to end. But instead of fear, she felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her chest. Mr. Morrison, she called back, her voice ringing with authority. You have 10 seconds to get off my land before I start shooting. Morrison's laughter was genuinely amused. Mrs. Hensley, you're holding a single-shot rifle against 7 armed men. That's not courage, that's suicide. Maybe, Clara replied. But I'll bet I can put you down before your men can reach me. Question is, are you willing to die for stolen cattle? The laughter died. Morrison's face went cold and calculating, the mask of false politeness finally falling away. Kill them both. The words were barely out of his mouth when Eli moved, diving sideways and rolling behind the thick wooden pillar that supported the porch roof. At the same moment, Clara dropped to one knee and brought Thomas's rifle to her shoulder, her father's training and 30 years of hunting taking over despite her racing heart. The first shot came from Morrison himself, his bullet splintering the wood beside Clara's head. She lined up her sights and squeezed the trigger, feeling the familiar kick of the rifle against her shoulder. Morrison's horse reared as the bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. Behind the water trough, Eli shouted, and Clara scrambled for the cover he indicated as gunfire erupted from all directions. Bullets whined through the air around them, splintering wood and raising puffs of dust from the yard. Clara pressed herself against the solid iron of the water trough, her hands shaking as she reloaded Thomas's rifle. How many shots do you have? Eli called out. 8 cartridges plus what's loaded. Make them count. Through the chaos of gunfire, Clara heard the sound she'd been praying for, the distant peal of the church bell from town. Someone had heard the shooting and was raising the alarm. If they could hold out long enough, help might arrive. But as bullets continued to fly and Morrison's men closed in on their position, Clara wondered if help would come in time to do anything but count the bodies. The gunfight had been raging for 10 minutes when Clara spotted something that made her heart soar, the glint of sunlight off a badge pinned to a familiar vest. Hidden behind the barn, Eli had retrieved his gun belt from where the sheriff must have returned it, and now the weapon that had once made him a feared killer was back in his hands. But it wasn't just the gun that transformed him. Clara watched in amazement as Eli moved with deadly precision, each shot calculated and purposeful. He wasn't the gentle ranch hand anymore. He was exactly what Morrison's men had feared, a professional who understood violence better than they did. Mrs. Hensley, Eli called out during a brief lull in the shooting. Can you see the silver badge on my vest? Clara squinted through the gun smoke and dust. Yes, I'm a deputy territorial marshal, has been for 2 years. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Eli wasn't just a reformed gunfighter, he was a lawman, working undercover to break up the rustling operation. Everything made sense now. His careful assessment of her ranch, his knowledge of the criminal networks, his willingness to risk his life protecting her. Wade Morrison had obviously heard Eli's announcement. "Doesn't matter what badge you're wearing, Boone," he shouted from behind his makeshift cover. "Dead marshals don't testify in court, but live ones do," came a new voice from the direction of the road. Clara's heart leaped as she saw Sheriff Rawlings leading a group of armed townsmen toward the ranch. Deputy Fletcher rode beside him, along with 6 other men she recognized from Dry Creek. The church bell had done its work. Help had arrived. Morrison's men found themselves caught between 2 forces now, with Eli and Clara holding the high ground near the house and the sheriff's posse approaching from behind. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. "This is Sheriff Rawlings," the lawman called out. "You men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Instead of surrendering, Morrison made a desperate decision. "Take the woman," he screamed to his men. "She's our way out of this." 2 of Morrison's gunmen broke cover and sprinted toward Clara's position behind the water trough. She raised Thomas's rifle and fired, her shot taking the first man in the leg and sending him tumbling to the ground. But the second man kept coming, and Clara realized with growing horror that she wouldn't have time to reload. That's when Eli appeared between Clara and the charging gunman, his own weapon steady in his hands. The confrontation lasted less than 2 seconds, a brief exchange of gunfire that ended with Morrison's man lying motionless in the dust and Eli still standing, untouched. "Stay down!" Eli shouted to Clara as he turned to face the remaining threats. The arrival of reinforcements had broken the resolve of Morrison's remaining men. 2 of them threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. A third tried to make a run for it, but was quickly ridden down by Deputy Fletcher. That left only Wade Morrison himself, wounded but still dangerous, crouched behind the overturned buckboard, with his gun trained on the approaching lawman. "It's over, Morrison," Sheriff Rawlings called out. "Your men are dead or captured. Give it up." "Not yet," Morrison screamed back. "I've got enough bullets left to take some of you with me." Clara could see the wild desperation in Morrison's eyes. This was a man who had built his entire life on violence and intimidation, and he wasn't going to accept defeat gracefully. She realized with growing dread that Morrison intended to go down fighting, taking as many people with him as possible. "Eli," she called out quietly, "he's not going to surrender." "I know." Eli's voice was grim. "Mrs. Hensley, when I move, you stay down no matter what happens. What are you going to do?" Instead of answering, Eli did something that shocked everyone present. He stepped out from behind cover, his gun holstered, and walked directly toward Morrison's position with his hands visible. "Morrison," he called out, "it's me you want. Let's finish this between us." Morrison rose from behind the buckboard, his gun trained on Eli's chest. "Finally showing some backbone, Marshal. Just tired of innocent people getting hurt because of our fight," Eli replied, continuing his steady advance. Clara watched in horror as the 2 men faced each other in the dusty yard, separated by perhaps 20 yards. She could see the calculation in Morrison's eyes, the slight tremor in his gun hand that spoke of his shoulder wound. But she could also see the deadly competence in Eli's posture, the readiness of a man who had survived countless such confrontations. "You cost me everything, Boone," Morrison snarled. 2 years of careful planning, a network that stretched across 3 territories, all ruined because you couldn't mind your own business. "Your business was murdering innocent families," Eli replied calmly. "Someone had to stop you. And now, someone's going to stop you." Morrison's gun began to rise, but Eli was already moving. Clara had seen gunfights before, had watched Thomas practice his quick draw behind the barn when he thought she wasn't looking. But she'd never seen anything like Eli's speed. His hand moved in a blur, the Colt appearing in his grip as if by magic. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, the reports echoing off the surrounding hills. For a moment, both men stood frozen in place, and Clara held her breath, terrified of what she might see. Then Wade Morrison toppled backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers, while Eli remained standing, smoke rising from the barrel of his weapon. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Clara realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to breathe as Eli holstered his gun and walked over to check on Morrison. After a moment, he looked up at Sheriff Rawlings and shook his head. "It's finished," Eli said simply. Clara rose from behind the water trough on unsteady legs, Thomas's rifle still clutched in her hands. The yard was littered with the aftermath of violence, wounded men, scattered weapons, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. But they had survived, and the threat that had haunted her ranch was finally ended. Eli walked over to where she stood, his face showing the exhaustion that came after extreme danger had passed. "Are you hurt?" "No," Clara managed to say. "But Eli, that badge you mentioned." "Deputy Territorial Marshal Eli Boone," he confirmed, pulling out a silver star that had been hidden beneath his shirt. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner, but the investigation required complete secrecy." Clara stared at the badge, then at the man who wore it. "So everything you told me about your past was true. I was a hired gun. I did kill those 3 men in Colorado, and I was wanted for murder. But the territorial government eventually realized they needed someone who understood the criminal networks from the inside. They offered me a chance to use my skills for law enforcement instead of private interests. And you accepted." "I accepted because it was a chance to do something meaningful with the abilities I'd developed, something that honored the memory of the families I'd failed to protect." Sheriff Rawlings approached them, his face showing a mixture of relief and admiration. "Marshal Boone, I owe you an apology. If I'd known you were working undercover." "You couldn't have known," Eli replied. "And frankly, your arrest probably saved lives. It forced Morrison to move faster than he wanted to, which made him careless." As the lawman began to clean up the aftermath and tend to the wounded, Clara found herself looking at her ranch with new eyes. The place that had been her peaceful refuge with Thomas had become a battlefield, but somehow it felt more like home than ever before. She'd defended it, fought for it, and proven to herself and everyone else that she was far from the helpless widow people assumed her to be. More importantly, she'd found in Eli not just a protector or a hired hand, but a true partner, someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought for home and family. "So what happens now?" Clara asked, as they watched the prisoners being loaded into a wagon for the trip to town. Eli was quiet for a moment, and Clara could see him wrestling with something important. "Now, I have to decide whether to return to territorial headquarters or what? Or ask a certain widow if she might consider keeping a deputy marshal on permanent staff." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. "In what capacity?" "Whatever capacity she thinks appropriate," Eli replied, his brown eyes warm with hope and affection. "I've gotten kind of attached to this place, and to the remarkable woman who runs it." Clara looked around at her ranch, scarred by battle, but still standing strong, and then at the man who had helped her save it. Thomas's ring still hung around her neck, but for the first time since his death, she felt ready to face the future instead of just surviving it. "I think," she said carefully, "that position might be available to the right applicant." Eli's smile transformed his weathered face. "I'd like to submit my application, ma'am." "Application accepted," Clara replied, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt truly, completely happy. 6 months after the gunfight, Clara stood in her kitchen preparing breakfast for 2, humming a tune she hadn't remembered in years. Through the window, she could see Eli working with a group of young cattle in the eastern pasture, the same pasture where he'd first repaired her broken fence. The ranch was thriving now, with legitimate cattle bought with the reward money from breaking up Morrison's rustling ring. The territorial government had been generous in their gratitude. Not only had they paid the bounties on Morrison and his men, but they'd also provided compensation for the use of Clara's ranch in their investigation. More importantly, they'd agreed to let Eli base his operations out of Dry Creek, making him the official law enforcement presence for the entire county. "Mrs. Hensley," came Eli's voice from the porch, followed by the sound of his boots being wiped clean before entering. "Just Clara," she corrected, as she had every morning for the past 3 months. "We've established that you're not my employee anymore." Eli entered the kitchen, his hair still damp from washing at the pump, and accepted the plate of eggs and bacon she handed him. The simple gold band on his left hand caught the morning light, matching the one Clara now wore on her own finger. Their wedding had been a quiet affair, just the two of them, Sheriff Rawlings as witness, and the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Dry Creek. Clara had worn her best blue dress, the one Thomas had always loved, and Eli had bought a new shirt specially for the occasion. It wasn't the grand celebration some might have expected, but it had been perfect for two people who had found love in the most unexpected of circumstances. "Janet stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Clara said, settling across from Eli with her own breakfast. "She wanted to apologize again." "She's apologized enough," Eli replied gently. "She was trying to protect you. Can't fault someone for that." Janet Morrison had been devastated to learn that her brother-in-law had been the leader of the rustling operation that terrorized the territory for years. She'd blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for not questioning his sudden wealth and frequent absences. Clara had forgiven her completely after all. Janet had been another victim of Wade Morrison's deception. "She also brought news from Colorado," Clara continued. "Reverend Samuel Morrison sends his gratitude. He's been officially cleared of any wrongdoing, and his testimony helped convict the last of the mining syndicate executives." Eli nodded, though Clara could see the shadow that always crossed his face when the past was mentioned. Some wounds, she'd learned, never fully healed. They just became part of the landscape of a person's character. "There's something else," Clara said carefully. "Janet mentioned that the territorial marshal wants to expand the law enforcement presence in this region. They're offering you a promotion to senior deputy, with authority over 3 counties. And that would mean more traveling, more time away from the ranch. From me." Eli set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. "Clara, I've spent most of my adult life moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I'm not interested in going back to that life. But it's a good opportunity." "This is a good opportunity," Eli interrupted, gesturing around the warm kitchen. "Waking up next to you every morning, working land that belongs to us, being part of a community that accepts us both. That's worth more than any promotion." Clara smiled, though she wanted to be certain. "You won't regret it, giving up the chance for advancement?" "The only thing I'd regret is losing what we've built here." Eli's thumb traced gentle circles on her hand. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on the local sheriff. Bill Rawlings is a good man, but he's getting on in years." Through the window, Clara could see the results of their joint efforts over the past months. The fences were strong and straight, the barn had been expanded to accommodate their growing herd, and the vegetable garden was flourishing under her care. More importantly, the ranch felt alive again, filled with purpose and hope. "I have something for you," Clara said, rising from the table. She walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a small wooden box that hadn't been there the day before. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, lay a deputy marshal's badge, not the temporary one Eli had worn during the investigation, but a permanent commission engraved with his name and the territory seal. "The territorial marshal delivered it personally yesterday," Clara explained, "along with authorization to establish a permanent office in Dry Creek. You don't have to travel anymore unless you want to." Eli stared at the badge, clearly moved. "Clara, this must have cost." "It didn't cost anything. You earned it." Clara pinned the badge to his shirt, her fingers lingering on the star-shaped metal. "Marshal Eli Boone, with full authority to keep the peace in Dry Creek County and beyond." "Marshal Boone," Eli repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like the sound of that. So do I, though I think I like the sound of my husband even better." They stood together in the morning light, streaming through the kitchen window, two people who had found in each other something neither had dared to hope for. Clara thought about the woman who had stood in the auction corral 6 months ago, desperate and alone, risking everything on a stranger's kindness. That woman could never have imagined the happiness that was possible when two damaged souls decided to heal together. "Do you ever think about Thomas?" Eli asked quietly. "Every day," Clara replied honestly, "but not with sadness anymore. I think about how proud he would be of what we've accomplished here, how much he would have liked you. You think so?" "I know so. Thomas always said that a man's character showed in how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him. You've shown me nothing but kindness and respect since the day we met, even when you thought I was just a foolish old woman making a mistake." Eli pulled her closer, and Clara marveled at how right it felt to be held by someone again. "You were never foolish, Clara. Brave, stubborn, impossibly optimistic, but never foolish." Outside, a meadowlark sang from the fence post, where Eli had repaired the gate so many months ago. The sound carried across the pastures where their cattle grazed peacefully, past the barn, where they'd shared their first honest conversation, to the little cemetery on the hill where Thomas rested beneath his simple wooden cross. Clara had visited the grave the morning of her wedding, carrying wildflowers from the meadow and wearing Thomas's ring on a chain around her neck. She told him about Eli, about the love she'd found when she thought love was finished with her. The wind had stirred the grass as she spoke, and Clara had chosen to interpret it as Thomas's blessing on her new beginning. "So what's next for us?" Clara asked, settling into the comfort of Eli's embrace. "More of this," Eli replied simply. "More mornings like this, more evenings watching the sunset from our porch, more nights falling asleep, knowing we're exactly where we belong." "Sounds perfect to me." As they stood together in their kitchen, planning their day and their future, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite fear, risking everything for the possibility of something better. She'd learned that love could bloom at any age, in any circumstance, between the most unlikely of people. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another, and that a heart opened by grief could be even more capable of joy than one that had never known loss. The laughter that filled their kitchen that morning was rich with contentment and bright with possibility. Outside, the ranch stretched toward the mountains, under a sky so blue it seemed infinite, and Clara Boone, for that was her name, now knew that the best chapters of her life were still being written. In Dry Creek County, they would tell the story for years to come, how a 65-year-old widow had surprised everyone by bidding on the most dangerous-looking man at the auction, and how that single act of courage had changed both their lives forever. But the townspeople could only tell the beginning of the story. The rest, the quiet moments of shared understanding, the gentle touches that spoke of deep affection, the daily choice to build something beautiful together that belonged to Clara and Eli alone. Unfolding one precious day at a time in the home they had fought to defend and chosen to share.